The story of how Mitsubishi started making planes is pretty typical for a Japanese company of the time. This esteemed manufacturer made a foray into this specific industry after World War I, as did many others. But it took the company roughly 2 decades to find its footing there. Not all of their original designs were a success. So, for quite a while, Mitsubishi engineers had to make do by assembling aircraft and engines under license. If you really want to succeed, though, quantity is bound to turn into quality. And that's what happened to Mitsubishi as well. And there are 2 specific names often mentioned when discussing the company's eventual rise to glory. The first of the 2 is Horikoshi Jiro. This ambitious and talented engineer was tasked to develop a new naval fighter for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that plane turned out to be a huge win for Mitsubishi and an excellent addition to their portfolio, as Horikoshi created the A-5M, the world's first naval monoplane fighter. Performance-wise, it was vastly superior to its biplane predecessors, so it's no wonder that the new fighter became an instant hit with Navy pilots. Obviously, Japanese decision-makers wanted Horikoshi to make the next model as well. This unexpected success gave the company opportunities that it did not waste. Instead, their engineers went all in on their new projects, and soon they had another win on their hands. We're talking about the Mitsubishi F-1M, a reconnaissance float plane designed by a team led by Hattori Yoji. This new biplane was the most produced Japanese aircraft of its class during World War II. Then there was another design, the Ki-21, which proved superior in a competition for a new heavy bomber held by the Japanese Army. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service used them in record numbers, and pilots loved the bomber because it was both reliable and easy to fly. But the true success was yet to come. The crown jewel of the Mitsubishi roster was obviously the legendary Zero, one of the most well-recognized aircraft in the history of aviation. Although the requirements for the new naval fighter were sent not just to Mitsubishi, but to their competitors as well, only Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi followed through. All their rivals pulled out of the competition, firmly believing that the requirements were unachievable. Indeed, the Zero had to become very peculiar in its design. Engineers had to make a lot of sacrifices to give it the range and maneuverability that the military wanted. Both fuselage and wings were constructed in one piece, not an ounce of armor. Large and extremely vulnerable fuel tanks. All of that was just the reality for most production Zeros, including the A6M2, the A6M3, and even the early A6M5. On the flip side, those planes could easily travel to the Philippines, engage in combat there, and then fly back home. Sakai Saburo, a legendary Japanese flying ace, once said that if Germans had 1,000 Zero fighters instead of 1,000 Messerschmitts, there'd be a very different outcome to the Battle of Britain. The second star engineer of Mitsubishi, Honjo Kiro, was responsible for designing bomber aircraft. Due to the success of design choices made by Horikoshi, the military wanted their new bombers to have unbelievable operational range as well, which naturally came at the expense of their ability to withstand damage. For example, the Mitsubishi G4M land-based naval bomber, created by Honjo Kiro and his team, had amazing range for a twin-engine aircraft, but it could only be effectively used if you had total air superiority. In fact, the bomber was so vulnerable to enemy fire and so prone to ignition after just a few hits to its fuel tanks that Allied pilots called it the Flying Lighter. After the start of World War II, the Imperial Navy realized that they needed a fast local defense interceptor, basically a direct opposite of the slow and agile Zero. And that's how the J-2M Raiden came to be. Interestingly enough, it was also designed by Horikoshi. It took the team several years to complete the job, but it was all worth it. This lightning-fast flying predator was even more impressive than its closest conceptual counterpart, the German Focke-Wulf FW-190. Fun fact: there was a very real possibility that the Raiden wouldn't reach production status due to severe problems with its engine. Thankfully, Mitsubishi was not just an aircraft manufacturer. When it came to making engines, this company was also one of the key players on the Japanese market. And so they were eventually able to sort it all out and succeeded in introducing a new serious threat to Allied forces in the region. After all, at the time of its arrival to the Pacific, the Raiden was faster than most comparable American designs. It was about that time when Mitsubishi also started working on the Ki-83, a new high-altitude twin-engine interceptor for the Army. The interesting thing about this aircraft is that it was powered by two turbo-supercharged engines. Yep, just like the American Lightning, just with a special exhaust arrangement providing some additional thrust. The Imperial Army also received the Ki-67 heavy bomber, which combined the excellent engineering of the G4M with two powerful engines of the Raiden. The aircraft was so well protected that there was even an attempt to use it as the basis for the Ki-109, a heavy interceptor designed specifically to hunt American B-29 bombers. Despite all that, most of the resources available to the company were still poured into designing aircraft for the Navy. The Mitsubishi A7M Reppu, also designed by Horikoshi, was supposed to replace the Zero as the main naval fighter in 1944, but it was ultimately doomed by problems in the engine department. The first variants of the A7M1, equipped with an 18-cylinder power plant, turned out to be underpowered. And when Mitsubishi finally had a suitable engine and the opportunity to build a few A7M2 variants, the country was already in ruins. The company tried to overcome those difficulties by introducing a line of rocket-powered interceptors based on the German Me-163. The variant for the Navy was called J-8M, and the Army one was called the Ki-200. But there was no time to properly bring either of them into full-scale production. The industry was already largely paralyzed, and by the end of August 1945, Japan finally surrendered. That didn't mean that Mitsubishi was completely out of business, though. With the start of the war on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. Air Force needed someone in the region to take care of their massive fleet of aircraft. Not to mention that the newly established Japan Self-Defense Forces also required modern combat planes. Soon, Mitsubishi factories were busy manufacturing North American F-86 Sabres under license, which were succeeded by the Lockheed F-104J and the iconic McDonnell Douglas F-4EJ Phantom II. Eventually, the company was able to design its own aircraft once again, leading to the creation of the F-1 fighter, as well as its two-seater trainer variant, the T-2. Today, Mitsubishi engineers are still hard at work developing new, exciting tech, while their combat and civilian vehicles are out there competing with the best designs the world has to offer, and sometimes coming on top as well.